The Daily Derech. We are walking the path of holiness.
Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein. Welcome to the Daily Derech, a special project of exploring Judaism, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, and the Rabbinical Assembly. Today is the 6th day after Shabbat Kodesh, the 30th of Nisan, 5786, corresponding in the secular calendar to Friday, April 17th, 2026. We will read Parashat Tazria Metzora this coming Shabbat, and it is the 15th day of the Omer. Let's begin. Me'am Loez on the Parsha. We're going to do our last day today of Tazria Metzora for this week because Shabbat is coming up. And so I figured I'd close out our week studying Tazria Metzora, not on its allegorical meaning or a lot of times, the sins that cause it and sort of exploring it philosophically, but at least take a day to really explore it halachically and see how did this actually practically work out and what did this look like? How do these laws work? Because I think it's so important, even though these laws are not in play anymore because we don't have a temple and thank God we don't get tzaraat anymore. It's still important for us to understand the laws themselves because it helps us to understand the laws conceptually even better once we can understand the practical laws and how they actually work. Then we can picture it a little bit. So we're going to go through today some of the practical halachot of this the laws of leprosy and tzaraat. So the Torah describes basically that someone gets a spot on their body that is the shade of white, somewhere around whiteness. And at that point, they're actually commanded at this point to seek out a kohen and for the kohen to examine their body and see if this is tzaraat or not. And this must be very, very difficult to do, which is why I think it's a commandment that they actually have to seek out a kohen to actually get this done and get this checked out. In general, in terms of identifying the information the kohen uses to identify what is considered a leprous mark and what is just considered an injury or any kind of other mark on the body, right? It's not like any injury on the body or any discoloration would mean someone has this unique disease or this divine punishment, divine disease, whatever you want to call it. But there are specific colors and specific statuses, factors that a kohen looks for to see if this mark is truly tzaraat or not. The major category is really what color it is. Generally, tzaraat is white. And there are generally two general categories or main categories of the color of what this is. One is a beheret. And a beheret in the Mishnah is described as basically white as clean snow that's just dropped, right? That there is no dirt on it yet. So this is the whitest it possibly means. And behira in general means like really bright or lustrous. So that would make sense that this is the brightest or the whitest of shades. The other shade is called tzara'at, and tzara'at is a little bit darker maybe, but still very white. And that's and they compare the white to what the wool of a lamb looks like when they're born. Okay, so very, very clean white, still very white, but maybe a little bit darker than white, clean snow. Now, there are generally two toledot. There's a toledah coming out of each of these avot, each of these general categories. So a toledah is an outcome or something that comes after it. And there's a toledah both of the beheret, the whitest snow mark, and a toledah of the tzara'at. And there are basically both a little bit darker colors. I'm not going to go into exactly what they look like. Obviously, we're not doing this today. And still, it's basically all different shades of white is what we're looking at here. But there are also other factors as well. So what the kohen also looks for is either that the mark is expanding. So it's not looking for, is it staying stagnant over time or is it expanding? And this is why a person is usually quarantined for, even if the mark doesn't seem like it's tzaraat or it's not definitely tzaraat, the person is still quarantined for 7 days, examined again, and then quarantined for another 7 days. So the best possible bet that can happen is the person is quarantined for 14 days, even if the mark is never shown to be actually tzara'at. So the number one fact is color, as I said. The second factor that's really looked for is, does this mark expand? And the third factor, is a little bit confusing actually, but it is what the Torah actually says, is that if there is healthy skin within the marking, right? So if there's if it was at one point fully white, and then it seemed that the middle of the skin was getting healthy again. In this case, it's actually another factor to declare it what we would call Metzora muchlat, right? A definite form of leprosy. And so this is very, very important and very interesting that if the mark just stayed the same and it stayed its normal shade of white, there's a much better chance of being purified from this tzaraat and for it not being declared tzaraat. But if some of the skin turns white on the it turns pure in the inside and turns healthy again on the inside, actually the tzaraat, there's more of a chance that there's leprosy. In any case, the kohen describes eventually and make sure that eventually this mark leaves, and then the person is brought back into the camp slowly again through a process I'm about to describe. But the person can stay indefinitely in quarantine outside the camp if the mark continues to expand, if it continues to be a certain shade, if there continues to be healthy skin inside. Then that means that the leprosy is actually staying there and needs to continue to be quarantined. And this can happen actually quite a long time. It really is dependent of when the mark heals, at least according to the standard set out by the Torah. Now, it's very interesting. How does a Metzora sort of come back into the camp? Someone who actually has a Metzora, but then the Metzora goes away, the leprosy mark goes away. How do they actually enter back into the camp? And it's, of course, very interesting the way that this happens. First, two birds. One is killed, is sacrificed. The other is let free, and also some different spices, things like that, hyssop and different scents. And the reason that usually the rabbis say this is the case is because birds are constantly chattering, right? And they kind of symbolize in that way for the sages lashon hara, right? The chattering of a human being. And so that's why these birds are sacrificed. So first this happens, but then another 7 days is still needs to be, the person needs to wait, even after they're declared tahor and after they're declared pure by the priest, and then they make this two bird sacrifice. They still have to wait another week, and eventually then they can enter the Ohel Moed again, once again to offer the final sacrifices, which is animals. And then once they offer that sacrifice, they are finally allowed fully back into the camp. So actually, people are declared tahor, are actually declared to be pure of tzaraat before they're actually allowed to enter the camp again. And I think what this shows, of course, is how careful the Torah is about the community, right? Even more than the individual can be pure. But if we're not 100% sure that nothing bad is going to happen to the community, we don't let this person back. And I think this shows again and again that the Torah definitely privileges community and the health of the community necessarily over the ease or the suffering of the individual. Mishnah Torah. We're going to continue learning the laws of Yesodei HaTorah, the foundations of Torah, the first section in Maimonides' law code, the Mishnah Torah. We're going to be learning the 8th and 9th halachot today. We've said a lot of things about God so far. Number one, that God exists, and number two, God is completely independent of everything else that exists in the world, and that God creates everything else in the world. And what we mean by, of course, that God is independent of everything is that God's existence is not dependent on any of God's creations, while all of God's creations are dependent upon God. In doing so, that makes God completely unique and completely different than everything else, which goes back to God's oneness, that God is completely different than anything else that exists in the world. Continuing on this concept of God's uniqueness, another way in which God is unique is that God has no form or no image, as is famously known by many Jews. This is something I think that confuses many people. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to my 6-year-old or in trying to explain to them how God doesn't have a form, and especially when she's growing older, she's like, really, God doesn't have a form? Like, does that mean God's not real? Like, are you just like, is she like the tooth fairy? And so let's talk about a little bit of reasons of why the Rambam says that God doesn't have a form and try to explain it to us. Because actually, I think once we understand it, we actually understand that God can't possibly have any form. And the fact that we can envision God having a form is actually because we're not envisioning what God really is. Let's take a look here. The eighth halacha begins, behold, it is explicitly stated in the Torah and the works of the prophets, the Holy One, blessed be He, is not confined to a body or physical form. Okay, and now he's going to prove this through verses and trying to explain the verses through his logic. So he says in Deuteronomy and also repeated in Joshua, it says, because God your Lord is the Lord in the heavens above and the earth below. And so if God was a body, how could God exist in two places? How could God exist both in the heavens and the earth? A body or a physical thing cannot be in two places at one time, right? That's a basic law of physical matter. Basically, that would then prove that, well, God can't be physical if God is both in heaven and in earth, number one. Number two, Deuteronomy 4:15, chapter 4, verse 15 says, for you did not see any image, okay, when talking about God on Mount Sinai. So it's saying even at the most revelatory moment, the Jewish people didn't see anything. Now, I don't think this can particularly be traced to the fact to prove that God doesn't have a body. It could just mean, well, God wasn't there. Maybe you would say, well, God really wasn't there, right? So I don't know if this is as good of a verse, but of course we have faith in the revelation of the Sinai moment. So if that's how God revealed God's self at Sinai, meaning not revealed God's self, at least physically, so too that would be God's form. I'm trying to understand it the best way I can here. But Isaiah also continues. He brings a verse there, to whom can you liken me? With whom I will be equal. And so this verse says you can't liken God to anything else. You can't compare God. And this, again, represents God's complete uniqueness and individuality, different than anything else that exists in the world. And how does the Rambam understand that? Were he confined to a body, he would resemble other bodies, right? So if God was physical, then you could say, well, God is physical just like everything else, right? Everything else is physical, so therefore you compare God to everything else. If God's really not gonna have anything in common with anything else, then God can't be physical, which is at least the way Maimonides is saying it here. But an immediate question comes up if you're a close reader of the Torah. You might have noticed that many, many times throughout the Torah and even in the Tanakh, it talks about God's body parts. Right, we hear of God's feet, God's fingers, the eyes of God, the hand of God, all of these different ideas. So, in general, what does that mean? If Rambam's going to start with this philosophical premise that God can't have a body, why would the Torah be talking about God's body parts? And generally, the way that he looks at this is the fact that God speaks in Lashon B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of human beings. And human beings can't picture something outside of a physical reality that's bound within time and space. So therefore, the Torah speaks of God's eyes and God's ears, not because God actually has God's eyes or God's ears, but because God sees and God hears. God sees and hears not the way humans do, but God sees and hears. So the way that the Torah communicates this is by saying God's ears, God's eyes. And even though God risks, you have to understand the risk that God is taking here is for people to mistake this imagery and believe that God is actually a physical. So why does God take this theological risk? It's because the Torah is the Torah. The Torah comes from the word instruction. It's supposed to actually instruct human beings, and it's specifically given to human beings. It's not given to angels. It's not given to things that don't have form or image, but rather people living in time and space who live and die. And human beings can actually only envision things that actually resemble time and space. And so, therefore, the Torah speaks that way, even though it risks creating an image of God that's not quite true. But it's still important. It was so important for God to communicate that God sees and God hears and God is responsive to the world, that God uses these personification or anthropomorphization qualities like God's eyes and God's ears just to communicate to human beings that God does see and God hears. But we should not assume that this actually is that God actually has eyes and God actually has ears. It's important for us to understand this. If you're interested in this conversation, you want to go deeper, actually, the beginning of Mor Nevuchim, the beginning of God for the Perplexed, goes through many chapters, and almost every time that God appears physical in the Torah and explains it philosophically and allegorically of why the Torah is like that, and just to back up the idea that God is truly not physical. Menorat HaMaor. Let's turn to that wonderful sefer, that Musar sefer that we learn that discusses the aggadot of the Talmud. So much of this book, and I think what makes it very unique, and also not an easy sefer, let me say that, is that it's built around the stories of the Talmud. It's built around midrashic material and the legends, the aggadot of the Talmud. Instead of trying to restate by one author what the Talmud actually means, it really just gives the goof, it gives the body of the text themselves. And so he's going to actually begin explaining here why Agada is so important. And I have to understand the context from which this is coming from. Agada and the stories, the legends, the homiletical material that's found within the Talmud was often sort of put to the side, and that the real stuff, the real important stuff, is the halacha, the laws, and that's really what matters, and sort of everything else is fluff. And of course, the Menorat HaMaor does not think that way. So he's going to try to understand, the importance of the aggadot here, the importance of both holding halacha, Jewish law, and aggadot together to learn them. And so he's going to talk a little bit about how aggadot came about and sort of how they were published. Generally, within Judaism, within the traditional sort of Jewish historiography, the understanding of Jewish history is that Rav Ashi was the one who redacted the Babylonian Talmud. And so he begins with Rav Ashi. He says, and when Rav Ashi, the redactor of the Babylonian Talmud, saw all these great subjects, which they possessed only orally, aside from a few matters that had been written down as brief notes and scattered on pages and leaves, for just as it was necessary to compile the traditions in order to explain the commandments and laws, so too it was necessary to preserve the expositions and narratives that had taken place in the days of our early ancestors. And it's so it's really interesting to see that just as the halachot, what we are required to, how we're required to behave in exacting manner, is so important for Rav Ashi to record and take down, it was also equally important for Rav Ashi, according to the Menorat HaMaor here, to preserve as well the stories, the expositions, the narratives of our sages and our ancestors, as which he says, from which one may learn halachot. You can actually learn Jewish law from these teachings. You can learn moral teachings, character traits, miracles, promises, great and really important things that make so that we can maintain our faith and our spirituality in this world. And so he's saying that these are really two-pronged things, the halacha and the agada together. And it's important that we don't just ask, what do I need to do as a Jew? Although that is definitely the main thing that we ask. What does God require of me? But how am I supposed to think? How am I supposed to see the world around me? And I think the Aggadot definitely helped that and inspired that in so many ways, which is, I think, what he's saying here. And it's one of the reasons why Rav Ashi sort of wove them into the halachot, the halachic discussions of the Talmud itself. And he says these are called Aggadot so that they would never be forgotten forever, but would remain as a memorial for anyone who studies them, to understand from them all that he is able according to the strength of his intellect, and to expound them to Israel in order to guide them on straight paths, and these are called Aggadot. Interestingly enough, Aggadot literally means tellings or stories, things you tell, things that are meant to tell out loud. And here you see the value that he places on these Aggadot as something that's so important that they should be a memorial. They should be a constant reminder for us to remember our values, remember who we are. And of course, they do require intellect to unpack and to understand them, but they still act as a wonderful guide to Israel. And sometimes I have to say to myself, like, obviously halacha is really important. So if God tells us something specifically that we need to do, we need to try to do it to the best of our ability. But what the Menorat HaMaor seems to be saying here is it's not just everything that God requires of you cannot just be explained through exacting detail of halacha, but there's sort of another dimension to it that's also important that sort of goes beyond the exacting fine nature, but it's taught through stories, and it's taught through ideas, and it's taught through narrative and homilies and everything like this. And So that's an important part of Judaism. And I think that gets back to the idea of like Judaism isn't just some recipe book. It's not like you can just read this recipe and then just do it and that's it. It's important. It's important to understand what the recipe is. But it's also the way the food is cooked, the way it's made, the way it's put together, the way it's talked about, the way it actually exists in life is often much deeper. And that's why you can't just like take a Judaism from a page of Torah, from a halacha code, and just say, this is what Judaism is. It's not. Judaism is always our history, our tradition, the way we see the world around us, and the way we actually live it out in our world. And I think that's something that he's saying, and that we have to really understand how the rabbis lived, not just what they commanded, but also how they lived in their lives. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Daily Derech. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me anytime at rmr@templeofaaron.org. Thank you so much for listening. There are so many people to thank, and you can look in the show notes for that. And also, if you want to know and see any of these texts in the original, we actually have that too. You can actually find that in our episode description. So look in each of the episode descriptions, and you'll find that information right there. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.